times of her answering questions of like, well, how did you not know? And she,
am I missing something here?
No, and this is your brain on drugs. The two things do not bleed over. And when I had come home, picking on me about my weight, I had gained about 10 pounds.
hey everybody, I'm trying to be enthusiastic here. Well, today's not really the video for it. Honestly, this is a crazy video today that I have for you. Also, first things first, my fiance said that, you know, you guys were going to get offended if I called you turds and kept it that way. I was just being goofy because turds is a funny word. And I'm a goofy person. And so I thought, oh, turds is cute. And then I let him see my video and he's like, why are you calling them turds? So if you guys are offended by turds, we can change it. It was just a suggestion to start with. I thought it was cute. You guys can let me know in the comments if you don't like it. Have some fun in your life. Have a little fun. Okay, anyways, we have this really just unhinged, crazy set of TikToks here to watch. This woman was married to a serial killer, serial unaliver, for 8.5 years. And this is her story of going through it, her journey with him. Okay, the first couple TikToks are like a backstory here, but then when you get to the third one, that's when things take it. The first couple talks about how she was with him, you know.
Story time about how I was married to a serial killer. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I'm gonna do this over several parts, but first let's just talk about how we met. Okay, so I was friends with this girl in the 6th grade, and we wound up living 3 doors down from each other. So we got to be really close, and I'd go over to her house after school a lot. And her brother was in the Navy, and so he wasn't around that much, and he was a lot older than I was, but he was in the Navy, and he would come home on leave. And that's how I got to know him, and I kind of had a crush on him. He was her older brother and everything. When I was about 16, he started flirting with me and decided to ask me out, and honestly, that probably sounds like a really red flag, but my family, their biggest red flag was just the fact that he was a lot older than me, but they felt kind of comfortable because they already knew the family and they could see how much we liked each other, so they supported it. Things moved really quickly, and before I knew it, he asked me to marry him. And honestly, that sounds crazy, except that my life was like really chaotic at the time. So when he asked me to marry him, I just jumped on it because it was like really the best thing I had going for me. So to answer a few of your guys' questions from my last video, yes, this is a true story about my life. And you guys definitely did your research. My ex-husband was Richard Ivanitz. I have written a book, and I'm looking for a publisher and agent. But in the meantime, I'm going to keep answering your questions, so stay tuned for part 2. Story time, how I was married to a serial killer, part 2. We got married in August of 1988, and we moved to Maine. And everything was fine at first. Honestly, I was happy to be married, and I had this, it was probably pretty immature fantasy about what married life meant, but I was happy to be up there and with him, and he very quickly took charge and let me know what my responsibilities were supposed to be to him as a wife, to clean the house and take care of all the cooking, and, he was in the military, so, there was, like, the lessons on how to properly launder his uniforms and do all of his creases just right, and I took all of this in and just worked really hard to please him, and I was happy to do that because, I loved him, and I was wanting to make him happy. Probably within the first month, things began to shift. He started picking on me about my weight. I had gained about 10 pounds, and he started, telling me I was fat and that I needed to join Weight Watchers. If I cheated on my diet, he would tell me, you're gonna wind up being fat like your mother, and you can't do that. You need to get back on your program. I mean, up until this point, I felt pretty good about things overall, but as time was going on, I was regretting my choice of getting married. But I had made a commitment, and, I believed in that commitment and in marriage, and that it's forever and that you have to work on it. And I also, had a lot of people tell me that I was too young to get married at the time. And so, I was pretty determined to prove everybody wrong that wasn't the case. Marriage was definitely not what I thought it would be. I'm going to go more into that in part 3.
Crazy how they all plan out. She does talk kind of slow, so I'm going to speed her videos up a little bit, I think, so that we aren't sitting here forever and it becomes a 4-hour video. Yeah, so like I said, this was a big backstory, basically, of her at their moving times and that, and like her backstory of getting into the marriage and being naive and things like that.
Story time about how I was married to a serial killer, part 3. Things started off kind of rocky the first year, but by the summer of 1989, Mark was stationed in San Diego for shore duty, so we set out on a new adventure. At first, everything seemed really fun and romantic, getting settled in our new place, but pretty soon, things really shifted. He wanted me to get a job, but in order to get a job, I needed to be away from the house, and he needed me to be there when he got off of work. And he would get home from work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And unfortunately, a lot of the jobs that I could get, having no education, meant, other than a high school diploma, it meant, evenings and weekends. And he didn't want me to do that. And he didn't support me in going to get a college education, which is something I thought I would be doing. Eventually, he did allow me to go to cosmetology school. Since it was only a year, he was willing to allow me to be away from home so that I could get situated with a job that would pay me more money than minimum wage, and I could work regular hours. Going to cosmetology school really opened up my world and allowed me to get out of the house and make new friends. He didn't really like that very much, and he made it really clear from the very beginning that I wasn't to talk to anybody about our problems. He would explain to me that married people talk to each other about their problems. They don't talk to other people about their problems. Of course, at this point I was 18, and I'm out there and I don't have any friends. I don't have any family around. And it was back before cell phones, back before the internet or email or anything, and it was a long-distance phone call that, kind of cost a lot of money back then, and he really limited the amount of money I was allowed to spend on phone calls to my family. Not having a lot of friends or anybody who I could talk to about my relationship, I really didn't know how different it was from the average marriage, and I really didn't have anybody to, bounce things off of and find out what was normal, which I think was probably exactly what he wanted. At this point, though, I was still committed to my marriage, and I was still committed to making it work, and most of the time, things weren't really that bad, and I had a pretty good life out in San Diego. Then everything shifted again because he got out of the military, and I'll talk about that in part 4. Story time. Being married to a serial killer, part 4. In November of 1992, Mark decided to get out of the military. The transition of him getting out of the military was a little rocky. He started having a lot of mood switches, and one day he came home. He was really frantic. He was just very anxious and beside himself, and he came in the door and he asked me, he said, "If I asked you to fly out of the country with me, would you do it?" And I was like, what do you mean? What the hell? Why would you ask me that? He's like, just answer the question. Would you go with me if I needed to get out of the country, if I wanted to leave the country? And I said, well, I don't know. Why do you need to go? I don't know if I want to live out. And he shut me down and he said, no, if I needed to leave the country, would you go with me? And I says, well, I guess so. We're married. Why am I going to stay here? Of course I'm going to go with you. And as soon as I said that, he just he breathed a big sigh of relief, and he's just like, oh, okay. He just kind of went on about his day, and he was just like, well, I just had I was just really stressed out. I just had a really rough day, and I just needed to know that, no matter what, you'd be with me. So there were things like that eventually played into future things. Looking back at that seems kind of crazy. But at the time, I thought he was just really stressed out about work because it was a huge transition for him to get out of the military and, move to Virginia and start a new life and try to get a job. We decided on Virginia because he had family in Virginia. We decided that instead of going to South Carolina where he was from and where his mom and sisters lived. With my cosmetology license, I couldn't do hair in South Carolina without doing more testing. Virginia had reciprocity with California, so it seemed like the perfect spot, and he really played it up and sold it to me that it was just going to be this really amazing place to be. I went along with it even though my family had moved out to San Diego since we were there, and I didn't know anybody in Virginia, and I would have rather gone back to South Carolina or even just stayed in San Diego because, my family had moved out there while we lived there. So, like I said, November 1992, we headed off for our next stop in Virginia. More on that in part 5.
Kind of help us get into the middle of things. where we're starting to see that he is becoming a little bit more unhinged, right? His choice of how he's treating her, getting her kind of controlled, letting her know that she's only allowed to do certain things. But thankfully, she has a pretty independent way of thinking, because she goes to being a waitress and to being back into it, being a hairdresser again.
How I Was Married to a Serial Killer, Part 6. Okay, I want to back up here for just a minute. A lot of you guys have been asking whether or not I knew about his conviction in 1987 prior to us getting together. So what he had told me about it was that he had been blacked out drunk. I guess he had a really severe drinking problem, and he was driving around Jacksonville, Florida, blacked out drunk, and apparently driving around naked. And some girls had seen him. This landed him arrested and in a rehabilitation center for his drug and alcohol addiction. By the next year, when we were starting to see one another, he had embraced his sobriety and his alcohol and drug-free lifestyle. Honestly, at the time, I was impressed. I thought that it took a lot of courage to face his inner demons and deal with the things that were causing him to drink. Of course, at the time, I was only 17. Actually, I was 16 at the time. So I really didn't know the greater implications of addiction, or even what it meant to have an addiction, or why people are addicted, or I didn't know any of that. At the time, I just thought he was doing really well, and I was impressed, like I said. And I was not somebody who drank at the time. I was a teenager, and we also have to back up that this was the 80s, and the big campaign on Just Say No, and This Is Your Brain on Drugs, and all that kind of stuff. I was 100% on board with that, and this had been drilled into my head since, I was 13 years old. So to be with somebody who was choosing a sober life really appealed to me. By the time we moved to Virginia, we had already been married for 4 years, and alcohol and drugs had never been a part of our relationship. So when he decided that he was going to start smoking pot and wanting me to do it, it was pretty alarming, because that was not something that I had planned on having in my life. And we have to remember, it was illegal then, and people were going to jail. And I didn't want to get in trouble for something that wasn't even part of my life. Having something in my house and not even having a choice about it put me at risk at also getting in trouble. I didn't find out the truth about his conviction until after I found out that he was a serial killer, back in 2002. That's when I found out that he had actually masturbated in front of a 3-year-old girl, I believe. Of course, that's a huge difference. And had I heard that, I definitely would have made a different decision about whether I wanted to be with this person. But at the time, all I knew was that alcohol had caused him to make a bad decision. That he had been drinking and he was blacked out and somehow took his clothes off and was driving around and somebody just happened to see him. That's all I knew. And in my 16-year-old brain, that made sense to me. More in Part 7. How I Was Married to a Serial Killer, Part 7. Okay, so I left off at the end of Part 5, where we were getting ready to buy a house in Virginia, and it was around that time when everything shifted. Somewhere around that time, he began having what I tend to refer to as rages, where 1 minute we would just be sitting there having a normal conversation, and the next minute he's up shouting at me and cursing, and one time he punched a hole in the wall. He would always wind up being emotional afterwards and crying and apologetic, talking about his childhood and all the terrible things his dad had done to him, and he'd swear that he was going to get help and that he would call somebody in the morning, and the morning would come and it would be as if nothing had happened, and he would just be carrying on with his day, and we never heard anything else about it. I kind of chalked up a lot of it to stress. We were getting ready we were building a house. He had changed jobs, and there were a lot of things that were up in the air at the time. And in my mind, I thought, well, once we get into our house and begin getting settled in our life, that he'll settle down and he'll be happy, and that this would all just kind of wash over. So when we were in our house about 6 months and he flew into one of these rages, this was the third time it had happened. And the first time being maybe 6 months to a year before. It was like happening this was like the third time in 6 months. And it really shattered my bubble. It shattered this whole fantasy that I had. I was moving into my new house and we were going to start a family, and I was meeting my neighbors, and we lived on a little cul-de-sac. It was like everything that anybody would ever want. But when this happened, it just shattered that bubble for me. And that's what made me start to question whether or not it was a good idea to try to bring a baby into this situation. Things felt really unstable to me, which made me feel kind of pretty unhappy. And he started to realize that I was unhappy and started to make demands of me to figure out what it was that I was going to do, if I was going to stay or if I was going to leave. I really didn't want to end my marriage. I just wanted to be happy, and I wanted stability, and everything that was happening made me feel really uneasy. So he agreed at first to go see a counselor, and we went to a couple of counseling appointments. I can't remember. I feel like I went on my own once. Maybe he went on his own once, and we went together. And when we went together, afterwards, he basically told me that he felt like the counselor was on my side and that she was biased and that he wanted to find a different counselor, or he just wasn't even willing to go because he felt like, it was just really unfair and that she was against him. I didn't really know what to do at the time, but eventually I decided to leave. Everything came to a head this one night when I had come home from a ballet class that I was taking, and the class ended at 9 o'clock, so I got home around 9:15 and I walked in the door. And when you walked into our house, there was like the entryway, and off the entryway was an office. He was sitting at the desk in the office, and he saw me walk by and immediately started berating me about, where have you been? What are you really doing? I know you're not taking a dance class. I know you're seeing somebody behind my back. Why don't you just tell me? You just want to leave. By this point, he had gotten up from behind the desk and was coming around and getting up in my face, continuing to yell at me about how I was lying to him and how he didn't believe me. When the phone rang, he decided to answer it while he was like in the middle of this fit he was beginning to have. As soon as he answered the phone, he flipped a switch. And he was like, "Hi, how are you? Gosh, it's so great to hear from you." And he walked right past me and went into the hallway and down into the basement to take the call. And it was at that time that I thought, I really need to get out of here right now, because that really freaked me out, that he shifted from really pissed off to super happy in just a snap. So I immediately grabbed my things. I already had my purse in my hand and my stuff, but I grabbed a couple more things and just slid right out the front door, got in my car, and I drove away. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I wound up calling a friend who let me stay at her house. And I actually stayed there, was able to talk to my family who were out in California at the time. And they encouraged me to come out there and stay with them for a little bit and try to figure things out. During that night, he was leaving messages on my cell phone, which sounded, he was really upset, saying things like, "Don't come home, you don't have a home, you've just ruined our entire marriage, we don't have a marriage anymore," just kind of crazy things like that. And it was upsetting to me. But at the same time, certainly looking back, I think, I wonder, if I hadn't left, what would have happened that night. At the time, I just felt really uncomfortable and thought I needed to not be home. It was after that I decided that I was going to go to San Diego, where my brother lived, and stay with him for a little while and start, moving on to a different part of my life. A couple of days later, we wound up talking on the phone, and he agreed that he would be out of the house on the weekend, and I could come pack up my stuff so that I could leave. And that's what I did. I spent the weekend in my home for the last time, and I packed up my car with as many things as I could, and I hit the road for California. More in part 8.
So it's good that she made the decision to get away at that time, I believe. Otherwise, she probably would have been one of the victims.
How I Was Married to a Serial Killer, Part 9. I left off last time when the FBI had dropped the news about Mark being a serial killer and how that changed my lens that I now looked back at my marriage. Suddenly, I had all these memories and all these things that never really stood out to me before, but in this new light, I started looking at things quite differently. One of the things was when we lived in San Diego, he always had me going to self-defense classes and was concerned that I know how to defend myself and was always looking over my shoulder and paying attention to my surroundings and getting quickly into my car, and if there was ever somebody who would approach me or if I was ever in a situation that I would know how to defend myself. That certainly looked a lot different looking back than it did at the time. I mean, of course, a lot of people did that. It was definitely interesting that he was basically teaching me how to protect myself against somebody like him. So the other thing that really stood out in my mind when I heard the news was when we were living in Virginia the last year. They thought at the time that there were 2 serial killers living among us. There was a lot of things that were happening. It was a pretty stressful time. It had a lot of us speculating about who this person was, and everybody was glued to the news, and it was just a really scary time, especially for women. I remember one evening in particular, after watching the news, being concerned and expressing my concern to him about that I was afraid, and I came home late at night. I would work until 9 o'clock at night at this point at the salon. I was worried about being out late by myself, and he assured me that he didn't really think I had anything to worry about because I didn't fit the profile of the women that were being killed. At the time, there was this guy who was pulling over women, flagging them down like they were having car trouble. Most of the people, I think, got away, but there was one girl who was murdered, and that's still, I believe, it's still an unsolved case at this time. That was the person I was worried about. We were all really stressed out about this thing. So he was telling me how I didn't fit the profile, and I didn't really understand what he was talking about because, I don't, I was never, and still not somebody who follows true crime. I was like, what do you mean profile? And he said, serial killers usually have a particular type of person that they're looking for. So maybe they don't like their mother, or they're angry with their mother. So they try to find somebody who looks like their mother. And they can kill their mother without actually killing their mother. I kind of understood what he was saying, but it didn't really make me feel any better because I kind of felt like there were too many things going on in the area at the time to make me just kind of feel at ease. And I wasn't following it closely enough to really be sure that I didn't fit some type of profile that he was talking about. But he was always reading everything and watching the news, and he was really up on everything. And he was kind of a know-it-all, and he liked to act like he knew everything. So I just kind of I sort of took his word for it and went from there. Looking back though, it certainly does seem like he's letting me know, hey, you're safe. It's not going to happen to you. The other thing is he always had kind of a dark sense of humor. And in just a sense of humor in general. He was always joking about everything. And then he often had a dark sense of humor. And a lot of people have a dark sense of humor. So again, not something that you would typically need to be concerned about. But looking back with this new lens, I distinctly remember a day when, again, it was during this time when there was a serial killer, and they were just starting to identify the fact that they felt like they had a serial killer on their hands. And we were getting ready for work, listening to the news, and Mark walks from the kitchen into the living room holding his bowl of cornflakes. And he's walking into the living room holding his bowl of cornflakes and the spoon, and he's stabbing the cereal with his spoon, saying, "Look, I'm a serial killer," as a play on words. At the time, I was just like, you're an idiot. That's not funny. But it's just kind of the way he was. He was always making light of things or just doing plays on words, joking around. I kind of rolled my eyes. I'm just like, oh my God, that's a bad one. And I went ahead and got ready for work and kind of went on about my day. And of course, looking back at that, that's fucking terrifying because he's basically telling me, hey, look at me, I'm a serial killer. He told me. I don't really know what to, again, don't know what to tell you guys. It's a whole nother thing, you know, like looking back is always different than when you're going through things. But those were two definite situations where looking back, it's pretty disturbing. More in part 10.
So, I mean, it's just crazy. Sometimes you really realize you don't really know a person. Should really all take a step back and are we not seeing the signs that we should see? You know, are we missing something? So thank you again for coming. Like I said, I love you guys. Don't be an asshole like this guy unaliving people and shit. It's just doesn't look good on your resume of a human. Okay? I demand that you guys not be assholes. Okay, I love you. See you tomorrow.